What most people misunderstand is that empaths are not afraid of being abandoned. They're afraid of being forgotten. And those are not the same thing. Because abandonment happens once. Forgetting happens every day, quietly, over time, layer by layer. The truth most empaths never realize is that the deepest pain in their life did not begin with a breakup. It did not begin with the avoidant who disappeared. It did not begin with the person who stopped texting back. It started much earlier, long before they knew what attachment was, long before they knew what anxiety was, long before they ever called themselves an empath. It started the moment they learned that love had to be earned. And once that lesson enters a child, it rarely leaves. You can see it in the relationships they choose, not because they consciously want pain, but because pain feels familiar and familiarity feels safe. That is why so many empaths end up loving people who cannot fully love them back. Not because they enjoy suffering, not because they have low standards, but because their nervous system has been trained to associate uncertainty with connection. What looks like patience is actually emotional conditioning. What looks like loyalty is actually survival. What looks like unconditional love is often a child desperately trying to finish a story that never ended. Maybe you know exactly what this feels like. Someone pulls away, you feel it immediately. Their energy changes. Their messages become shorter, their enthusiasm disappears. The warmth that once felt natural suddenly feels forced. And instead of asking yourself why they changed, you start asking yourself what you did wrong. You replay conversations, you reread messages, you analyze every detail, every pause, every word, every silence. Not because you are irrational, because your mind learned long ago that distance means danger. And when distance feels dangerous, your brain starts searching for solutions. Maybe if you explain yourself better, maybe if you become more understanding, maybe if you become less needy, maybe if you become easier to love, this is where the trap begins. Because the empath does not respond to emotional distance by moving away. They respond by moving closer. They do not pull back. They try harder. They do not stop giving. They give more. They do not ask whether the relationship is healthy. They ask what else they can do to save it. And the heartbreaking part is that this pattern often starts in childhood. A child who receives consistent love learns something simple. I am loved because I exist. But another child learns something very different. I am loved when I perform. I am loved when I help. I am loved when I stay quiet. I am loved when I make everyone else comfortable. I am loved when I solve problems that were never mine to solve. That child grows up, the body grows older, the wound does not. Years later, they enter a relationship, and without realizing it, they bring the same emotional contract with them. They do not ask, do I feel safe here? They ask, how much of myself do I need to sacrifice to keep this person close? That question becomes invisible, but it quietly controls everything. Every text they send, every boundary they ignore, every red flag they explain away, every second chance they give, every goodbye they never say. Because underneath all of it is one terrifying belief. If I am not useful, I will not be loved. And once that belief exists, it creates an entire emotional reality. You stop choosing relationships, you start earning them, you stop receiving love, you start working for it. You stop asking whether someone is emotionally available. You start asking whether you can become enough for them. That is why the empath wound is so difficult to see. It disguises itself as kindness. It disguises itself as patience. It disguises itself as compassion. But underneath those beautiful qualities is often a frightened child still waiting for someone to finally choose them without conditions. Not because they fixed everything, not because they proved their worth, not because they suffered enough, just because they existed. And perhaps the hardest truth of all is this. The relationships that hurt empaths the most are rarely the ones where they were unloved. They are the ones where they almost felt loved, because almost creates hope, and hope keeps people waiting, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. This is why the childhood wound never truly feels like the past, because every emotionally unavailable person reopens it. Every mixed signal reactivates it. Every moment of emotional withdrawal reminds the nervous system of something it learned long ago. Love can disappear at any moment. And if love can disappear at any moment, then you must work harder to keep it. But what if that was never true? What if the deepest wound was not abandonment? What if it was the belief that love had to be earned in the first place? What most empaths never realize is that the relationship did not become painful when the avoidant pulled away. It became painful the moment they started chasing the return, because that is where the loop begins. Quietly, almost invisibly. At first, everything feels different. The connection feels rare. Conversations flow effortlessly. They seem interested, present, open. You feel understood in a way you have not felt for a long time. And for someone who spent years feeling emotionally unseen, that kind of connection feels powerful. It feels meaningful. It feels like home. Then something changes, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for you to notice. Their replies take longer. Their energy shifts. The warmth feels weaker. The attention becomes inconsistent. They do not disappear. They simply become less available. And that is what makes it confusing. Because if they vanished completely, you would have your answer. But they do not. They stay just close enough to keep hope alive. This is where overthinking begins. You tell yourself they are busy, stressed, distracted, going through something difficult. You give them the benefit of the doubt. Then another day passes, another short message, another cancelled plan, another moment where something feels off, but nothing can be proven. And now your mind starts working overtime. You replay conversations, looking for clues. You examine every interaction. You wonder whether you said something wrong, whether you asked for too much, whether you became too emotional, too available, too attached. What most people misunderstand is that empaths do not obsess because they are needy. They obsess because uncertainty activates old wounds. The nervous system hates incomplete stories. And avoidance creates incomplete stories better than almost anyone. They do not reject. They withdraw. They do not end things. They create ambiguity. They do not say no. They stop saying yes. And ambiguity is where the empath suffers most. Because the empath does not know whether to stay or leave, fight or surrender, hope or let go. So they stay in the middle, waiting, analyzing, trying to solve a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. Then the avoidant comes back, maybe with a message, maybe with affection, maybe with a sudden burst of attention that feels exactly like the beginning again. For a moment, everything feels normal. The anxiety disappears. The confusion fades. The connection feels real again. And this moment becomes incredibly important because the empath mistakes relief for love. What feels like connection is often the temporary ending of emotional withdrawal. What feels like passion is often the nervous system finally relaxing after prolonged uncertainty, but because the relief feels so powerful, the brain remembers it. And this is where emotional conditioning begins. Pull away, return, pull away, return. Distance, closeness, silence, affection. The cycle repeats over and over again, layer by layer, month after month, sometimes year after year, until the empath no longer measures the relationship by consistency. They measure it by moments. One beautiful conversation becomes enough to justify weeks of confusion. One affectionate weekend becomes enough to excuse months of emotional distance. One vulnerable moment becomes enough to restart hope all over again. The avoidant pulls away. The empath moves closer. The avoidant feels pressure. The avoidant withdraws further. The empath becomes more anxious. The empath reaches harder. And both people unknowingly reinforce the exact behavior that keeps the cycle alive. This is why the loop feels impossible to escape, because both people are reacting to fear. The avoidant fears losing independence. The empath fears losing connection. The avoidant creates distance to feel safe. The empath closes distance to feel safe. And Each person's solution becomes the other person's trigger. The more the empath reaches, the more trapped the avoidant feels. The more the avoidant withdraws, the more abandoned the empath feels. Neither person is trying to hurt the other, yet both end up hurting each other repeatedly, quietly, predictably, almost mechanically. Over time, the empath begins losing something far more important than the relationship. They begin losing trust in themselves. They stop asking what they feel. They start asking what the other person feels. They stop asking what they need. They start asking what the other person needs. They stop listening to their intuition. They start negotiating with it. Every red flag becomes a misunderstanding. Every concern becomes self-doubt. Every painful experience becomes another opportunity to be more patient, more understanding, more compassionate. What looks like emotional maturity is often self-abandonment. What looks like unconditional love is often the inability to walk away. What looks like strength is often fear disguised as loyalty. And the tragedy is that most empaths do not even notice it happening. Because the process is gradual, nobody wakes up one morning completely disconnected from themselves. It happens layer by layer, boundary by boundary, compromise by compromise, until one day they realize they have spent months carrying a relationship that was supposed to be carried by two people. They realize they have been fighting for a connection that only exists during brief moments of emotional availability. They realize they have become responsible for maintaining something they never had the power to control. And yet even then they stay, because hope is still alive. Hope whispers that the old version of the avoidant will come back. Hope whispers that if they just love harder, understand more, wait longer, everything will finally make sense. But the painful truth is this: the loop survives because hope survives. Not hope for what is happening, hope for what could happen. And as long as the empath remains attached to potential, they remain trapped inside a relationship that never fully exists in the present. This is why the pain feels endless, because they are not grieving what they lost. They are grieving what they keep expecting to receive. And those are two very different kinds of pain. What most people misunderstand is that this dynamic is not created by bad intentions. It is created by old survival strategies. That is why it feels so confusing. Because when empaths look at avoidance, they often see someone who does not care enough. Someone who is emotionally unavailable. Someone who keeps running from intimacy. But what looks like indifference is often fear. What looks like emotional distance is often emotional protection. What looks like rejection is often a nervous system trying to avoid vulnerability. And this is where the story becomes much deeper than most people realize, because the avoidant is not running from you. They are running from what closeness activates inside them. The empath thinks the relationship is about connection. The avoidant experiences the relationship as exposure. The empath feels safer when intimacy increases. The avoidant often feels less safe. The empath moves toward vulnerability. The avoidant unconsciously moves away from it. Not because they do not care, because somewhere in their emotional history, closeness became associated with discomfort. Maybe love felt controlling. Maybe vulnerability felt dangerous. Maybe emotional needs were ignored. Maybe dependence led to disappointment. Whatever the reason, the nervous system learned a lesson long before adulthood. Closeness equals risk. And once a nervous system learns that lesson, it carries it everywhere, into every relationship, into every conversation, into every moment where someone gets too close. This is why avoidants often seem most connected at the beginning. In the beginning, there is possibility without responsibility, attraction without exposure, connection without dependence. Everything feels safe because nothing important has been asked yet, but then the relationship deepens. Expectations appear, emotional investment increases, vulnerability becomes unavoidable. And suddenly, the same connection that felt exciting begins to feel threatening. The avoidant starts creating distance, not because the relationship became worse, because it became real. Meanwhile, the empath experiences something completely different. What most people misunderstand is that empaths are not addicted to pain. They are addicted to connection. But when connection becomes inconsistent, something changes inside the brain. The empath does not simply want closeness. They start chasing the return of closeness. And that distinction changes everything, because now they are no longer responding to the present. They are responding to a memory. They are trying to get back to how things felt before, back to the attention, back to the warmth, back to the version of the relationship that made them feel chosen. This is where childhood enters the story again, because many empaths learned very early that love was something that could disappear. One day they felt seen, the next day they felt invisible. One moment they received affection, the next moment they received criticism. One moment they felt important, the next moment they felt forgotten. These experiences create a nervous system that becomes highly sensitive to emotional changes, not because the child is weak, because the child learns that paying attention is necessary for survival. They learn to read faces, read moods, read energy, read silence, long before they learn to read themselves. And years later, that same skill follows them into adult relationships. They become experts at understanding everyone except themselves. They know when someone is upset before a word is spoken. They know when someone's energy shifts. They know when something feels wrong. But they often do not know how to trust what they know, because somewhere along the way they learned that other people's emotions matter more than their own. This is why the empath and avoidant dynamic feels so powerful. It activates both wounds simultaneously. The avoidant fears losing autonomy. The empath fears losing connection. The avoidant manages fear through distance. The empath manages fear through closeness. Each person's coping strategy accidentally intensifies the other person's wound. And because both people are acting from unconscious patterns, the relationship begins to feel strangely familiar, almost destined, almost magnetic. But familiarity is not always compatibility. Sometimes familiarity is simply recognition. The nervous system recognizing an old emotional environment. The empath recognizes uncertainty. The avoidant recognizes emotional distance. Both people mistake recognition for chemistry. This is why some relationships feel intense from the beginning. Not because they are healthy, because they are familiar. The nervous system is not asking, is this good for me? The nervous system is asking, have I been here before? And when the answer is yes, attraction can become incredibly powerful, even when the outcome is painful. This is also why logic rarely breaks the cycle. People often tell empaths to move on. Stop caring. Stop chasing. Stop overthinking. But the problem is not intellectual. The problem is emotional conditioning. The body is responding to patterns that were established years before conscious awareness existed. Every withdrawal activates old fears. Every reconnection activates old hope. Every cycle strengthens the pathway further, layer by layer, quietly, over time, until the relationship feels less like a choice and more like gravity. This is the part most people never see. The empath believes they are fighting for love. The avoidant believes they are fighting for freedom. But underneath both struggles is the same hidden wound: fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of losing themselves. Fear of needing someone. Fear of being left. Fear of being trapped. Different behaviors, same fear. Different coping mechanisms, same pain. And once you understand that, something important begins to change, because the relationship stops looking random. It stops looking like bad luck. It stops looking like a mystery. You begin seeing patterns instead of people, systems instead of incidents, emotional conditioning instead of destiny. And for the first time, you start realizing that what felt like the most personal rejection of your life may have never been about your worth at all. It may have been two wounded nervous systems unknowingly reenacting lessons they learned long before they ever met. What most people misunderstand is that they are not trapped by love. They are trapped by anticipation. And that distinction changes everything, because the empath looks at the relationship and tells themselves a story about patience, a story about loyalty, a story about understanding someone deeply enough that eventually they will feel safe enough to stay. The empath believes they are fighting for connection. They believe they are fighting for the relationship. They believe they are fighting for someone they genuinely love. But what if that is not what is happening at all? What if the thing keeping you attached is not love? What if it is the emotional reward system that formed around unpredictability? This is the invisible trap almost nobody talks about, because it does not feel like a trap. It feels like hope. It feels like devotion. It feels like commitment. But underneath those labels is a psychological pattern that quietly controls the entire relationship. The avoidant pulls away, anxiety appears, the avoidant comes back, relief appears, then the cycle repeats. Distance, relief, distance, relief, distance, relief, over and over again. And every time relief arrives, the brain pays attention, not because the relationship is healthy, because the nervous system is desperate for certainty. What most empaths never realize is that the strongest emotional experiences are not always created by love. Sometimes they are created by inconsistency. The human brain is wired to chase unpredictable rewards. A reward that arrives every time becomes expected. A reward that arrives randomly becomes addictive. This is why casinos work. This is why social media works. And this is why emotionally inconsistent relationships become so difficult to leave. The empath is not just attached to the person. They become attached to the possibility of the person, attached to the version that appears during the good moments, attached to the connection that exists for brief periods before disappearing again. They stop relating to reality. They start relating to potential. And potential is one of the most dangerous emotional drugs in existence, because potential never asks for evidence. Potential survives on imagination. It survives on memories. It survives on isolated moments that seem to prove everything can still work. The empath remembers how they looked at the beginning, the conversations that lasted for hours, the affection, the vulnerability, the feeling of being understood. And each time the avoidant withdraws, the empath tells themselves that version still exists somewhere underneath the distance. They just need more time, more patience, more understanding, more love. But what looks like hope is often reinforcement. What looks like dedication is often conditioning. What looks like faith in the relationship is often faith in a fantasy. And that is where the trap becomes invisible, because nobody realizes they are chasing dopamine. They think they are chasing love. Every unexpected text creates excitement. Every moment of affection creates relief. Every return creates euphoria. Not because the relationship suddenly became healthy, because uncertainty temporarily disappeared. The empath mistakes emotional relief for emotional intimacy. They mistake the ending of pain for the presence of love. And over time, the nervous system begins craving the cycle itself. Is the part that is hardest to accept. Because most empaths see themselves as people who love deeply, and they do. But deep love and emotional addiction are not the same thing. Love creates stability. Addiction creates obsession. Love creates peace. Addiction creates anxiety. Love expands your life. Addiction narrows it. Yet when the cycle becomes strong enough, the two become difficult to distinguish. The empath starts checking their phone constantly. They start monitoring changes in behavior. They start measuring the relationship through signals. One message can determine their mood for an entire day. One delayed response can create hours of emotional distress. One small sign of affection can restore hope instantly. This is no longer connection. This is conditioning, quietly, layer by layer, over time, until the relationship begins controlling emotional states that should never have belonged to another person. The most painful part is that the empath often interprets this intensity as proof that the relationship matters. They think, if I feel this much, it must be real. If I cannot stop thinking about them, they must be important. If losing them hurts this badly, they must be the one. But intensity is not proof of compatibility. Intensity is often proof of activation. The relationship feels powerful because it activates old wounds. It activates abandonment fears. It activates childhood uncertainty. It activates the need to earn love. The stronger the activation becomes, the more meaningful the relationship appears. But meaning and activation are not the same thing. What you thought was love may actually have been longing. What you thought was patience may actually have been self-abandonment. What you thought was loyalty may actually have been fear of letting go. What you thought was fighting for the relationship may actually have been fighting against reality, because reality was speaking the entire time. Reality was in the inconsistency. Reality was in the emotional unavailability. Reality was in the repeated pattern. But hope kept translating those signals into something else. Hope said they are just scared. Hope said they are healing. Hope said they will change. Hope said your love will be enough. And the longer hope survives, the longer the cycle survives. This is why so many empaths stay long after the relationship stops nourishing them. They are not attached to what exists. They are attached to what almost exists. And almost is one of the most painful places a person can live. Almost loved, almost chosen, almost prioritized, almost seen, almost safe, almost enough. Years can disappear inside that word. Entire relationships can disappear inside that word. Entire identities can disappear inside that word, because almost keeps the future alive. And as long as the future remains alive, the present never has to be faced. But sooner or later, something begins to crack. Not because the avoidant changes, not because the relationship improves, because exhaustion finally becomes stronger than hope. And when that moment arrives, the empath begins seeing something they could not see before. They were never trapped inside a love story. They were trapped inside a reinforcement loop. And once you see the loop, you can never unsee it. Because for the first time, the question stops being why they keep pulling away and becomes something far more important. Why have you spent so long chasing someone who keeps teaching you that love must be earned? What most people misunderstand is that healing does not begin when the relationship ends. Healing begins when the story changes. Because for most of the relationship, the empath has been living inside a story that places them at the center of the problem. If the relationship is struggling, they must not be understanding enough. If the avoidant is pulling away, they must be asking for too much. If the connection is fading, they must be doing something wrong. This belief becomes so automatic that it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like reality. Every painful moment passes through the same filter. What did I do? What should I have done differently? How can I fix this? How can I make them feel safe? How can I become someone they can finally stay for? The empath becomes the problem solver in a problem they did not create. And because they are focused on fixing, they never stop to ask a much more important question. What if this was never about my worth in the first place? This is usually the turning point, not a dramatic breakup, not a final conversation, not some perfect moment of closure. The real turning point is often much quieter than people expect. It arrives during one ordinary moment when something suddenly stops making sense. Maybe the avoidant disappears again. Maybe another promise goes unfulfilled. Maybe another cycle repeats exactly as it always has. But this time, something feels different. This time, the empath notices the pattern instead of the incident. For the first time, they stop looking at the latest withdrawal as a unique event. They start seeing it as part of a system. The same distance, the same confusion, the same return, the same hope, the same disappointment, again and again and again. And once the pattern becomes visible, something inside begins to shift. Because patterns tell a different story than isolated events. Events create hope. Patterns create clarity. An event says, maybe things will change. A pattern says, this is what keeps happening. And clarity changes everything. Suddenly the empath begins remembering things they spent months trying not to see. The conversations that never led anywhere. The needs they never expressed because they were afraid of creating pressure. the boundaries they abandoned to keep the peace, the emotional labor they carried alone, the excuses they made for behavior they would never accept from themselves. One memory connects to another, then another, then another, until a picture begins to emerge, not a picture of failure, a picture of imbalance. What most empaths discover at this stage is deeply uncomfortable. The relationship was never being built by two people equally. It was being sustained by one person's effort and another person's inconsistency. This realization hurts, not because it is new, because it has been true for a very long time. The empath simply could not see it while they were busy trying to save it. This is why awareness often feels painful before it feels empowering, because awareness destroys illusions. The illusion that enough patience would change everything, the illusion that enough love would heal everything, the illusion that enough sacrifice would finally create security. One by one, these beliefs begin falling apart, and beneath them sits a truth that changes everything. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. You were never too emotional. You were emotionally invested in someone who could not meet you where you were. You were never difficult to love. You were trying to receive love from someone who experienced intimacy as pressure. This is where the empath begins, separating their identity from the dynamic. For months or years, they believed the relationship reflected their value. If they were chosen, they were worthy. If they were abandoned, they were not. If they were pursued, they mattered. If they were ignored, they did not. Their self-worth became attached to someone else's availability, but slowly that connection starts breaking apart. They begin realizing that another person's inability to connect is not evidence of their inadequacy. Another person's withdrawal is not proof of their unworthiness. Another person's fear is not their responsibility to solve. This realization feels almost shocking at first, because the empath has spent so much of their life carrying emotional responsibility for everyone around them. They carry parents, friends, partners, entire relationships. They became experts at understanding other people's pain while ignoring their own. And now, for the first time, they are confronted with a question they have rarely asked. What about me? What about my needs? What about my exhaustion? What about the parts of me that have been waiting all this time to receive the same care I keep giving away? This question changes the direction of attention. Instead of constantly looking outward, the empath begins looking inward. Instead of analyzing another person's behavior, they begin examining their own patterns. Not with blame, with curiosity. Why did inconsistency feel familiar? Why did uncertainty feel attractive? Why did I stay so long? Why did I work so hard to earn something that should have been freely given? These questions do not create shame. They create understanding, and understanding creates freedom. Because once the empath sees their role in the pattern, they stop seeing themselves as powerless, not responsible for the relationship, responsible for their participation in it. That distinction matters, because power returns the moment responsibility becomes accurate, not exaggerated, not minimized, accurate. The empath begins realizing they were never powerless. They always had choices. They simply could not see them while they were trapped inside survival patterns. They could have left sooner. They could have spoken up sooner. They could have honored their own needs sooner, not because they were weak, because their wounds were making decisions for them. And now those wounds are finally becoming visible. This is the moment the story changes. The relationship is no longer viewed as evidence that they were not enough. It becomes evidence of a pattern they are finally ready to outgrow. The avoidant is no longer the center of the story. The empath is. The question is no longer why the avoidant could not stay. The question becomes why the empath kept abandoning themselves to make someone else stay. And once that question appears, something remarkable begins to happen. For the first time, the empath stops chasing answers from the person who hurt them. They start finding answers within themselves. And that is the moment real change begins. What most people misunderstand is that reclaiming your power is not about becoming colder. It is not about becoming harder. It is not about caring less. The empath hears phrases like let go, detach, move on, and often imagines becoming someone they are not. someone indifferent, someone emotionally unavailable, someone who stops feeling deeply. But that is not what healing asks of you. Healing does not ask you to stop loving. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself in the name of love. And those are completely different things. Because the truth is, the empath's greatest strength was never their ability to care for others. Their greatest strength was their capacity for depth. The problem is that depth became misdirected. Instead of using that depth to understand themselves, they used it to understand everyone else. Instead of listening to their own needs, they became experts at anticipating the needs of others. Instead of protecting their own energy, they spent years managing other people's emotions quietly, automatically, over time, until self-abandonment started feeling normal. This is why boundaries feel so uncomfortable at first. Not because boundaries are wrong, because they challenge an identity that has existed for years. The empath often believes that being a good person means being endlessly available, being endlessly understanding, being endlessly forgiving. But what looks like compassion is not always compassion. Sometimes it is fear. Fear that saying no will make someone leave. Fear that speaking up will create conflict. Fear that protecting yourself will make you selfish. And because that fear feels so real, the empath keeps sacrificing pieces of themselves in exchange for temporary connection, one boundary ignored, then another, until eventually they can no longer recognize where the other person ends and they begin. What most people misunderstand is that boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are information. They tell you where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. They tell you what belongs to you and what does not. They tell you which emotions you are meant to carry and which emotions were never yours to carry in the first place. The empath spends years carrying responsibilities that were never theirs. They carry other people's healing, other people's growth, other people's fears, other people's decisions, other people's avoidance. They believe that if they just understand enough, love enough, support enough, they can create change. But understanding someone is not the same thing as being responsible for them. Loving someone is not the same thing as saving them. Caring about someone's pain is not the same thing as carrying it. This is where emotional detachment begins to take on a different meaning. Most people hear detachment and think distance, but true emotional detachment is not distance, it is clarity. It is the ability to care without controlling, to love without rescuing, to support without sacrificing yourself, to remain connected to another person without disconnecting from yourself. That shift changes everything, because suddenly the empath stops chasing outcomes. They stop trying to force understanding. They stop trying to manage how other people feel. They stop treating every relationship problem like a puzzle that must be solved. Instead, they begin paying attention to reality, not potential, not promises, not possibilities, reality. What is actually happening? What is actually being given? What is actually being reciprocated? This is where silence becomes powerful. Not silence as punishment, not silence as manipulation, silence as observation. For years, the empath used action to manage anxiety. More texting, more explaining, more understanding, more effort, more patience. But every time anxiety appeared, action followed. And because action followed anxiety, the nervous system never learned that uncertainty could be survived. The empath became dependent on doing something, anything, to reduce discomfort. But healing introduces a different possibility. What if you did not chase? What if you did not explain? What if you did not rescue the connection every time it started falling apart? What if you simply observed? At first, this feels terrifying, because observation reveals things that chasing often hides. Observation reveals who reaches out when you stop reaching. Observation reveals who values your presence when you stop proving your value. Observation reveals who reciprocates when effort becomes equal. And that information can be uncomfortable, because sometimes the relationship only existed because you were carrying it. Sometimes the connection only survived because you kept reviving it. Sometimes the intimacy was not mutual. It was maintained by your fear of letting it die. But painful information is still valuable information because reality is always more useful than illusion. This is the moment where emotional control begins emerging naturally, not because you force yourself not to care, because your sense of worth slowly stops depending on someone else's behavior. Their silence no longer defines your value. Their withdrawal no longer defines your attractiveness. Their inability to commit no longer defines your worthiness. You begin separating your identity from their choices, and that separation creates freedom. What most empaths discover at this stage is surprising. The more they stop chasing, the more they can actually see. The more they stop forcing, the more reality reveals itself. The more they stop trying to control outcomes, the more energy returns to them. Energy that was once spent analyzing, waiting, hoping, fixing, rescuing, explaining, suddenly becomes available for something else, themselves, their growth, their peace, their future, their own emotional world. For the first time, they begin realizing that the relationship was never the source of their value. It was simply the place where they kept trying to find it. And that realization changes everything, because once value comes from within, relationships stop feeling like survival. They become choices. Once self-respect becomes stronger than fear, boundaries stop feeling cruel. They feel natural. Once emotional security comes from inside, inconsistent love stops feeling irresistible. It starts feeling exhausting. And perhaps the most important shift of all is this. The empath finally understands that protecting themselves is not the opposite of love. It is one of the highest forms of love they can practice. Because every time they choose themselves, they are teaching the wounded child inside something they never learned before. Love does not require self-abandonment. Love does not require suffering. Love does not require earning. Love begins the moment you stop giving away the very thing you have been searching for in everyone else. What most people misunderstand is that the final stage of healing is not letting go of the other person. It is letting go of the version of yourself that needed them to choose you. Because in the end, the deepest wound was never the avoidant. The deepest wound was never the silence. The deepest wound was never the distance. The deepest wound was the belief that someone else's love could finally give you what you never learned to give yourself. That is why the pain felt so personal. It was never just about losing a relationship. It felt like losing a chance to finally be enough, a chance to finally be chosen, a chance to finally prove that all the effort, all the patience, all the understanding had been worth something. But healing changes the question. For most of the journey, the empath asks one thing over and over again. Why didn't they choose me? Why didn't they stay? Why didn't they fight for this the way I did? Why wasn't my love enough? Those questions create endless suffering because they keep attention focused on the other person, focused on their decisions, their fears, their limitations, their inability to meet you where you were. But eventually another question appears, a question so simple that it changes everything. Why was I willing to abandon myself just to avoid being abandoned by someone else? That question leads somewhere different. It does not lead toward blame. It leads toward freedom. Because suddenly the story is no longer about what someone did to you. It becomes about what you are finally ready to stop doing to yourself. The empath begins remembering things that were impossible to see before. They remember how often they ignored their intuition. How many times they felt something was wrong but convinced themselves to stay. How many nights they spent analyzing instead of resting. How many boundaries they crossed on their own behalf. How many needs they silenced. How many truths they explained away. Not because they were weak, because they were scared that choosing themselves would cost them the connection. But now something has changed. They finally understand that keeping the connection cost them themselves. And that realization carries a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of getting everything you wanted, the peace of finally seeing things clearly. Because clarity removes the burden of false hope. It removes the exhausting responsibility of trying to create a future that another person is unwilling or unable to build with you. It removes the endless mental negotiations, the constant wondering, the constant waiting, the constant search for hidden meaning behind every action and every silence. Reality becomes simple again. Not easy, simple. Someone either shows up or they do not. Someone either reciprocates or they do not. Someone either creates safety or they do not. The empath no longer needs to decode every signal because they are finally willing to trust what they see. This is where the childhood wound begins losing its power. Not because the wound disappears, because it is no longer in control. The child who once believed love had to be earned starts learning something entirely different. Love that must be earned is not love. Love that requires constant self-sacrifice is not love. Love that only appears after suffering is not love. Real love does not ask you to become less of yourself to receive it. Real love does not demand endless proof of your worth. Real love does not survive on confusion. And perhaps for the first time, the empath begins understanding why the cycle lasted so long. It was never random. It was never bad luck. It was never a series of unfortunate relationships. It was a pattern built on old wounds, old fears, old beliefs. The avoidant was not the source of the pain. The avoidant was the mirror that reflected a wound that already existed, a wound that kept whispering the same message. Work harder, give more, be better, earn it. And now that whisper is finally losing its authority because another voice is beginning to emerge. A quieter voice, a stronger voice, a voice that no longer asks how to become enough, a voice that already knows. This is why the final shift feels so strange at first. The person you once obsessed over starts occupying less space in your mind, not because you forced yourself to forget them, because they are no longer connected to your identity. They are no longer the keeper of your worth. They are no longer the answer to a question you have already answered for yourself. The need to be chosen slowly dissolves. The need to prove yourself begins fading. The need to chase starts disappearing. And one day you notice something unexpected. The silence that once terrified you now feels peaceful. The distance that once triggered panic now creates clarity. The uncertainty that once controlled you now reveals information. What used to feel like loss starts feeling like liberation. Because the relationship taught you something far more valuable than how to hold on. It taught you how to stop abandoning yourself. And maybe that was the lesson hidden underneath everything. Maybe the childhood wound was never meant to be escaped. Maybe it was meant to be understood. Because once it is understood, it stops running your life from the shadows. It stops choosing your relationships. It stops deciding your worth. It stops turning love into labor. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all arrives at the very end. You were never rejected. You were kept inside a loop created by two wounded people trying to protect themselves in opposite ways. One ran from intimacy. The other chased it. One feared losing freedom. The other feared losing connection. And neither pattern had anything to do with your value. The moment you truly understand that, something inside finally becomes still. Not because the past changes, because your relationship with it does. And maybe for the first time in your life, you stop asking who will choose you, because you already have. Not everyone deserves access to your depth.